I went to a party looking for my fiancée and found her in a hot tub with two guys while someone filmed. She slurred, "Don't tell him." When I took the phone from the guy recording and hit play, the address Cassidy had texted me led to a warehouse in the industrial district, which seemed like an odd location for any kind of party. I parked my car between a BMW and a Mercedes, noting that the lot was full of expensive vehicles that didn't match the rundown exterior of the building. My phone showed her last message from 3 hours ago with just the address, and "Come find me when you get off work," followed by a heart emoji. Since then, nothing. My calls went straight to voicemail, and my text showed as delivered but unread. I pushed through the heavy metal door and immediately felt disoriented by what I encountered. The interior had been completely transformed into something that looked like it belonged in a luxury hotel rather than an abandoned warehouse. Crystal chandeliers hung from exposed beams, and the concrete floor had been covered with expensive rugs and lounge furniture arranged in intimate clusters. A full bar stretched along one wall, staffed by bartenders in crisp white shirts who moved with practiced efficiency. The lighting was perfect, not too bright, but not dim enough to feel like a typical party. Everything felt calculated and intentional in a way that made my skin prickle with unease. The guests matched the upscale atmosphere. Women wore cocktail dresses and heels that would cost me a month's salary, while men dressed in tailored suits or expensive casual wear that somehow looked both relaxed and deliberate. I felt immediately out of place in my work clothes, dress pants, and a button-down that had been wrinkled from a long day at the office. Nobody seemed to notice my arrival, which was strange because at a real party someone always acknowledges a newcomer. These people continued their conversations without breaking rhythm, holding champagne flutes and laughing at intervals that felt choreographed. I scanned the main room for Cassidy's distinctive red hair, but couldn't locate her among the crowd. A woman in a black dress approached the bar near where I stood, and I took the opportunity to ask if she'd seen my fiancée. I described Cassidy's appearance and mentioned she would have arrived several hours earlier. The woman looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between sympathy and amusement, before shaking her head and walking away without saying a single word. The interaction left me more unsettled than if she'd simply said no. I moved deeper into the warehouse, passing through an archway into a second room that had been set up as a dining area. Long tables held elaborate food displays that seemed untouched despite the number of guests present. Silver platters were arranged with precision, garnishes placed at exact angles, and everything looked more like a photograph than actual food meant to be eaten. A few people stood near the tables holding small plates, but I noticed they were mostly pushing food around rather than actually eating. One man caught my eye and quickly looked away, returning his attention to the woman beside him with forced intensity. My phone buzzed with a text from my business partner Vincent asking how my evening was going. I ignored it and continued searching, climbing a metal staircase to a second level that overlooked the main floor. Up here the atmosphere shifted slightly, becoming less formal but somehow more intentional. Smaller groups clustered in corners, their conversations hushed and serious. I noticed several people holding professional cameras, not phones, but actual equipment with external microphones and stabilizers. One person adjusted lighting equipment near a makeshift lounge area, and another checked settings on what looked like a sound recording device. Something was definitely wrong with this party. The more I observed, the more details jumped out at me. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something, checking watches and glancing toward the back of the warehouse where another set of doors led to what I assumed were additional rooms. Two men in dark clothing stood near those doors like security guards, though they wore no visible identification or uniforms. When I approached them to ask about Cassidy, they stepped together to block my path. One of them asked if I was on the list. I told them I wasn't sure what list they meant and that I was just looking for my fiancée who had invited me to this party. The two men exchanged a glance that communicated something I couldn't interpret, and then the one on the left spoke into a small radio device clipped to his collar. After a moment of listening to a response I couldn't hear, he stepped aside and gestured for me to pass through the doors. The ease with which they let me through after that radio call made my stomach tighten with anxiety. Beyond those doors, a concrete hallway stretched toward the back of the building. The polished atmosphere from the main party area disappeared here, replaced by industrial functionality. Exposed pipes ran along the ceiling, and the walls showed water stains and peeling paint. My footsteps echoed in the empty corridor as I passed several closed doors, each one making me more nervous about what I might find. Music thumped faintly from somewhere ahead, different from the smooth jazz that had been playing in the main rooms. The hallway terminated at another door, this one propped open with a wooden wedge. I stepped through into what had been converted into an outdoor courtyard space, though the outdoor part was actually just an open section of the warehouse where the roof had partially collapsed years ago. Someone had turned the structural damage into an intentional design feature, with the night sky visible above and potted plants arranged to create a garden atmosphere. String lights hung overhead, and in the center of the space sat an elevated hot tub that was currently occupied. My heart dropped into my stomach when I recognized Cassidy's red hair. She sat in the hot tub between two men I'd never seen before, all three of them in swimwear. Cassidy wore a black bikini I didn't recognize, and the men flanked her closely enough that their shoulders touched hers. A fourth person stood outside the hot tub holding professional camera equipment, filming the scene with focused attention. Several other people stood around the perimeter of the area, some holding clipboards and others adjusting lights that were positioned to illuminate the hot tub. Cassidy saw me the moment I stepped into the courtyard. Her eyes went wide and her face drained of color despite the warm steam rising from the water. She lurched forward slightly, causing small waves to splash against the sides of the hot tub, and her mouth opened as if to say something before the words finally came out in a desperate slur that didn't sound quite like her normal voice. She said, "Don't tell him," while gesturing frantically with one hand, and I couldn't tell if the slurring was from alcohol or panic or something else entirely. The two men beside her turned to look at me, and I noticed they seemed more annoyed than surprised by my presence. One of them, a muscular guy with a tribal tattoo covering his shoulder, said something to Cassidy that I couldn't hear over the bubbling water. The person with the camera kept filming for a few more seconds before lowering the equipment and looking towards someone I couldn't see who was apparently giving directions from outside my field of vision. I strode forward and demanded the camera from the person holding it. He hesitated and looked toward that same invisible authority figure for guidance. When I reached for the camera more aggressively, he finally handed it over without resistance, stepping back with his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. The camera was still recording, and I could see the viewfinder showing the hot tub scene from moments before. I stopped the recording and navigated to the playback function, my hands shaking enough that I had trouble pressing the right buttons. When the video finally began playing, I expected to see whatever had just transpired in the hot tub. Instead, the footage showed something completely different. The timestamp indicated the recording had started 40 minutes earlier, and the scene showed Cassidy and the two men in different positions, clearly rehearsing movements and speaking lines to each other. Someone off-camera called out directions about blocking and camera angles. Cassidy repeated the same gesture 3 times, adjusting her expression slightly with each take. The two men practiced their positioning, moving closer and then farther away based on feedback from whoever was directing. Cassidy climbed out of the hot tub and grabbed a robe that someone handed her from a nearby chair. Water dripped from her hair onto the concrete as she walked toward me, her expression a mixture of shame and desperation. The two men remained in the hot tub, watching our interaction with the detached interest of people who had seen this kind of drama before and knew it had nothing to do with them. The camera operator stood awkwardly to the side, clearly uncertain whether to retrieve his equipment or give us space. I demanded to know what was happening, and Cassidy pulled me away from the hot tub area toward a corner of the courtyard where we could speak with marginally more privacy. She kept glancing back at the film crew as if worried they would overhear, though at this point I couldn't understand what difference it made. Her hands trembled as she tightened the robe around herself, and when she finally started talking, the words came out in a rushed confession that explained everything and nothing at the same time. She told me she'd been working as an actress for the past 6 months, not in theater or legitimate film productions, but in low-budget streaming movies produced by small independent companies that paid cash and asked few questions. She said she'd needed money desperately to cover her mother's cancer treatment, which had exceeded what insurance would pay and left them facing tens of thousands of dollars in medical debt. She'd been too ashamed to tell me because I'd already helped her through college, and she didn't want me to think she was using me as a financial resource for her family's problems. I tried to process this information while watching her face for signs of deception. The story made sense on the surface. Her mother had been diagnosed with aggressive lymphoma 18 months ago, and I knew the treatments had been expensive. Cassidy had always been independent about money, insisting on paying her own way even when it created financial strain. But something about the timeline felt off, and the explanation didn't account for why she'd invited me to what was clearly a closed film set or why she'd panicked so completely when I arrived. I asked to see proof of what she was claiming. Cassidy hesitated before pulling out her phone from a waterproof bag near the hot tub and showing me several emails from the production company. The correspondence confirmed her employment and showed payment schedules that aligned with what she described. Contract documents outlined her role in various projects, all of them independent films with titles I'd never heard of and descriptions that sounded like generic romantic dramas. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The production company name was Vertice Entertainment Solutions. I'd seen that exact name 3 weeks ago when reviewing our shared credit card statement and noticed several charges that seemed unusual. At the time, I'd assumed it was some subscription service Cassidy had signed up for and forgotten to mention. But seeing it now in the context of her employment created a completely different picture. I pulled up our banking app on my phone and showed Cassidy the credit card statement. There were 7 charges from Vertice Entertainment Solutions over the past 4 months, each one for amounts ranging from $300 to $800. I asked her why she would be paying money to a company that was supposedly employing her. Cassidy's face went pale in a way that had nothing to do with the cool night air, and she looked at the screen for a long moment before her expression crumbled. She admitted that her mother's treatment had actually ended 4 months ago. The cancer had gone into remission, and while there were still follow-up appointments and monitoring, the expensive interventions had concluded. But by that point, Cassidy had gotten used to having the extra income from her acting work. The money was better than anything she could make in her regular job at the marketing firm, and it came with flexibility that allowed her to maintain her normal schedule. She'd continued taking roles even after the medical debt was paid off, telling herself it was building savings for our wedding and future together. The credit card charges, she explained, were fees for premium placement with the production company. Vertice Entertainment Solutions operated on a model where actors could pay for priority consideration for roles and better projects. She'd convinced herself it was an investment in her acting career, even though she'd never mentioned having any interest in professional acting before her mother's diagnosis. The whole thing sounded increasingly like a scam designed to extract money from desperate people, and I felt anger rising in my chest at the thought of Cassidy being exploited. But then another detail caught my attention. I scrolled through my photo gallery to a picture I'd seen on Cassidy's phone 2 months ago when she'd asked me to text a photo to her sister. I'd noticed the image while finding the right file, and it had stuck in my memory because Cassidy had claimed the people in it were colleagues from a work conference she'd attended. The photo showed Cassidy at a restaurant with 3 other people, all of them laughing at something outside the frame. I zoomed in on the face of one of the men in that photo and then looked back at the hot tub where the 2 actors still sat. The man with the tribal tattoo on his shoulder was the same person who'd been sitting beside Cassidy in that restaurant photo. I showed Cassidy the image and asked her to explain why someone she described as a work colleague from a conference was now filming scenes with her in a hot tub. Cassidy's composure finally broke completely. She sank down onto a metal folding chair that had been set up for crew members and put her face in her hands. When she spoke again, her voice came out muffled and defeated. She said the actors she worked with regularly had become something like friends, people she saw more often than her real friends because of the filming schedules. They'd gone to dinner after a particularly long shoot, and she'd taken the photo because she'd been feeling good about the work she was doing. She'd lied about the conference because she knew I'd ask questions about why she was having dinner with actors, which would have led to revealing her secret employment. The rationalization sounded hollow even as she said it. I pointed out that maintaining an entire secret life with people I'd never met went far beyond simple privacy about a side job. She'd created elaborate cover stories, hidden financial transactions, and built relationships with people she actively concealed from me. The lying was systematic and sustained over months, which indicated this was more than just embarrassment about needing money. A woman approached us holding a clipboard and asked if we were going to continue filming or if they needed to reset the scene for another day. She addressed Cassidy by name and mentioned something about the shooting schedule being tight and the location rental expiring at midnight. Cassidy told her they needed to stop for the night, and the woman sighed with obvious frustration before walking away and speaking into a radio device similar to what the security guards had been using. I watched the film crew begin breaking down equipment and realized the scale of the operation was larger than I'd initially understood. This wasn't some amateur production thrown together with minimal resources. The cameras were professional grade, the lighting setup was sophisticated, and the crew moved with the efficiency of people who did this regularly. Whatever Vertice Entertainment Solutions was producing, they had significant funding and organization behind it. Cassidy stood up and said we should go somewhere private to talk properly. She suggested leaving the warehouse and going to a coffee shop or back to our apartment where we could discuss everything without the film crew watching. But I wasn't ready to leave yet. Too many questions remained unanswered, and the situation felt increasingly like there were layers I hadn't uncovered. The way the security guards had let me through after a radio call, the way Cassidy had panicked specifically about me not telling someone, the way the crew seemed unsurprised by dramatic confrontations on their set. Before I could articulate my concerns, a man in an expensive suit walked into the courtyard from a different entrance than the one I'd used. He was probably in his mid-40s with graying hair and the kind of confident posture that suggested he was accustomed to being in charge. Several crew members straightened up when they saw him. and the woman with the clipboard immediately approached to give him what looked like a status report. Then the man turned toward me and Cassidy, and he smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. He said my name. I had never seen this man before in my life. Yet he spoke my name with the familiarity of someone who knew exactly who I was and why I was there. He walked toward us with measured steps, his expensive shoes clicking against the concrete floor of the courtyard. The crew members parted to let him pass, and I noticed several of them wouldn't make eye contact with him. Cassidy went rigid beside me, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edges of her robe. The man introduced himself as Patrick Hendricks, director of tonight's production. He said he was glad I'd finally arrived because they'd been waiting for me to make my entrance. His words made no sense in the context of what I understood to be happening. I told him I wasn't part of any production and that I'd simply come looking for my fiancée after she'd stopped responding to my messages. Patrick smiled wider and said that was exactly the role I was supposed to play. Before I could respond to this bizarre statement, another figure emerged from the shadows near the far side of the courtyard. This person I recognized immediately. Vincent walked into the light wearing casual clothes that probably cost more than my car payment, his hands in his pockets, and an expression on his face that mixed triumph with something darker. My business partner of 5 years looked at me the way a chess player looks at an opponent who just realized they were in checkmate. Vincent said hello and asked if I was surprised to see him. The question was rhetorical because he continued talking before I could answer. He explained that everything happening tonight had been arranged specifically for my benefit. The warehouse party, the film production, Cassidy's involvement, and my eventual discovery of her in the hot tub were all components of an elaborate scenario he designed over the past 2 months. Every element had been carefully orchestrated to create this exact moment. I felt like the ground was tilting beneath my feet. I looked at Cassidy, searching her face for some indication that she was as confused as I was, but instead I saw guilt and recognition. She'd known Vincent would be here. She'd known this was more than just a filming location. The realization hit me like physical force, and I stepped back from both of them as my mind raced to understand the full scope of what was happening. Vincent began explaining his reasoning with the calm rationality of someone who'd rehearsed this speech many times. He said he'd discovered 2 months ago that I was planning to dissolve our business partnership and restructure our tech startup in a way that would effectively remove him from the company. He'd found draft documents on our shared server outlining a buyout offer that would give him a fraction of what his stake was actually worth. The discovery had prompted him to do research into my activities and intentions, which had led him to uncover my plans to push him out completely. I didn't deny it because Vincent was absolutely correct about my intentions. Our company had reached a point where Vincent's contributions were minimal while his equity stake remained substantial. He'd been coasting on the work I'd done to build our customer base and develop our product, and I'd been consulting with attorneys about the best way to restructure ownership. The draft documents he'd found were preliminary versions of a buyout proposal that would have offered him $2 million for his 40% stake in a company now valued at over $20 million. Vincent said that amount was insulting given everything he'd invested in building the company from the ground floor. He described feeling betrayed by someone he'd considered a friend and partner, though I noted he didn't mention that his investment had been primarily capital from his family, while I'd contributed thousands of hours of actual work. His sense of betrayal was focused entirely on the financial loss he would suffer, not on any damage to our relationship. So he'd created this situation as leverage. The plan was straightforward in its cruelty. Vincent had researched Cassidy's financial situation and discovered her mother's medical debt through methods he didn't specify, but that I assumed were questionable at best. He'd approached her through an intermediary with an offer to help pay the medical bills in exchange for her participation in what he described as an independent film project. The money he'd offered was substantial enough that Cassidy had agreed, without asking too many questions about the production company or its intentions. Over the following months, Vincent had paid Cassidy increasingly large amounts to continue working with Vertice Entertainment Solutions, a company he'd specifically created for this purpose. The acting roles were real in the sense that footage was being filmed, but the ultimate goal was always to create compromising material that could be used against me. The hot tub scene I'd interrupted was designed to look like infidelity, something Vincent could document and threaten to release if I proceeded with pushing him out of the company. The brilliance of his scheme, Vincent explained with obvious pride, was that I would be caught in a moment of extreme emotional volatility. He'd expected me to physically confront the actors in the hot tub or to assault Cassidy in my anger and betrayal. The cameras would capture everything, giving Vincent documentation of me committing assault or domestic violence. That footage combined with the appearance of Cassidy's infidelity would destroy my credibility and reputation, making it impossible for me to proceed with removing him from the company. He'd miscalculated my reaction, But that didn't matter because he still had hours of footage showing Cassidy in various compromising situations. He could edit the material to tell whatever story he wanted, and my relationship with Cassidy would be destroyed regardless of whether I'd been violent. The threat of releasing the footage publicly would force me to accept whatever terms Vincent demanded for staying in the company. I let Vincent finish his explanation before I started laughing. The sound was unexpected enough that several crew members turned to look, and Vincent's confident expression faltered slightly. I told him his plan had a significant problem, which was that I'd known about his scheme for 3 weeks. The private investigator I'd hired to document Vincent's mismanagement of company funds had uncovered his connection to Vertice Entertainment Solutions on September 20th. The investigator had traced payments from Vincent's personal accounts to the production company and then from the production company to Cassidy. When confronted with this evidence, the investigator had approached Cassidy directly and explained that she was being used in a potential criminal conspiracy. Cassidy had been horrified to learn the true purpose behind the acting work. She genuinely believed she was participating in legitimate film productions, and the realization that Vincent had manipulated her financial desperation made her furious. The investigator had offered her immunity from any legal consequences in exchange for her cooperation in exposing Vincent's scheme. She'd agreed immediately and had continued playing her role for the past 3 weeks to help me build a comprehensive case against Vincent. Every interaction Cassidy had with the production company since then had been documented. Every payment had been traced. Every instruction from Patrick Hendricks and his crew had been recorded with equipment the investigator had provided. Cassidy had worn a wire to several meetings and had saved all text messages and emails related to the production. The investigator had even gotten Patrick to discuss Vincent's true intentions on a recorded phone call by pretending to be a potential investor in future projects. But the surveillance hadn't stopped there. I'd also been documenting Vincent's embezzlement from our company. The buyout offer Vincent had found wasn't actually my plan for removing him from the business. It was bait I deliberately left where he would find it, knowing his reaction would reveal his true character and likely prompt him to do something desperate. While Vincent had been focused on creating his blackmail scheme, I'd been working with a forensic accountant to trace his theft of company funds. Vincent had been stealing from our business for over 18 months through false vendor accounts and inflated expense reports. The total amount exceeded $2 million, which explained how he'd been able to fund his elaborate revenge plot against me. Every fake invoice had been documented, every fraudulent payment had been traced, and every piece of evidence had been compiled into a file that was currently in the possession of my attorney. I pulled out my phone and showed Vincent a text message from my attorney confirming that everything was ready. The message had been sent 15 minutes ago, right around the time I'd walked into the warehouse. My attorney and the forensic accountant were waiting in a vehicle outside with complete documentation of Vincent's crimes. I'd allowed tonight to proceed because I needed Vincent to fully commit to his scheme, giving me evidence of conspiracy and attempted extortion to add to the fraud charges. Vincent's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: disbelief, anger, fear, and finally calculation as he tried to determine if I was bluffing. I watched him reach for his phone, probably intending to delete evidence or warn someone, and I told him not to bother. All of his communications had been legally monitored for the past week through a court order I'd obtained by showing a judge preliminary evidence of his fraud. The color drained from Vincent's face as the full weight of his situation became clear. Vincent's hand froze halfway to his pocket where his phone rested. Patrick Hendricks had gone completely still, his earlier confidence replaced by the wide-eyed expression of someone who'd just realized he was standing in the middle of a crime scene. Several crew members began whispering to each other, and I could see a few of them edging toward the exits. The entire atmosphere in the courtyard shifted from theatrical drama to genuine panic. Cassidy moved to stand beside me, and for the first time that night, I saw her as an ally rather than someone I wasn't sure I could trust. She told Vincent that she'd been recording their conversations for weeks and that everything he'd said about manipulating her and using her financial situation against her was documented. She pulled a small recording device from the pocket of her robe and held it up so Vincent could see the red light indicating it was still capturing audio. Vincent tried to recover his composure by claiming everything had been a misunderstanding. He said the production company was legitimate and that he'd simply been helping Cassidy find work to pay her medical bills. The film project was real, and if I'd misinterpreted his involvement as something sinister, that was my paranoia rather than his intention. His voice had taken on a pleading quality that reminded me of a child making excuses after being caught doing something forbidden. I told him to stop talking because every word he said was making his legal situation worse. Then I called my attorney and put the phone on speaker so everyone in the courtyard could hear. My attorney confirmed that he and the forensic accountant were entering the building and that I should keep Vincent at the location until they arrived. The attorney also mentioned that he'd contacted the police and that officers were en route to secure the scene and potentially make arrests. That final piece of information caused the courtyard to erupt into chaos. Several crew members immediately abandoned their equipment and ran toward the exits. Patrick Hendricks tried to follow them, but two of the larger crew members who'd apparently decided cooperation was their best option blocked his path. One of them said that Patrick had been lying to everyone about the nature of the production and that they wanted nothing to do with whatever criminal activity he'd been orchestrating. Vincent made a last desperate play. He lunged toward the nearest camera equipment and grabbed one of the devices that had been used to film Cassidy. He tried to remove the memory card, presumably hoping to destroy evidence, but the camera operator whose equipment he'd seized wasn't willing to let his expensive gear be damaged. A brief physical struggle ensued with Vincent trying to pry open the camera housing while the operator attempted to wrestle it away from him. I moved to intervene, but Cassidy was faster. She'd apparently been taking self-defense classes during her time working with the production company, possibly because she'd felt unsafe in some of the situations Vincent had put her in. She struck Vincent's wrist with a precise blow that made him release the camera with a yelp of pain. The camera operator stumbled backward, clutching his equipment protectively, while Vincent cradled his wrist and glared at Cassidy with pure hatred. My attorney arrived with the forensic accountant and two police officers who'd been waiting outside. The officers immediately took control of the situation, separating everyone into different areas and beginning to collect statements. Vincent was informed that he was being detained for questioning regarding fraud and embezzlement charges. Patrick Hendricks was also detained after one of the officers reviewed the recordings Cassidy had made, which included Patrick explicitly discussing how the footage would be used to blackmail me. As the police processed the scene, more details emerged that made Vincent's scheme even more damning. The forensic accountant had brought documentation showing that Vincent had created 5 separate false vendor accounts over 18 months. Each account had submitted invoices for services that were never actually provided, with payments being deposited into accounts Vincent controlled. The total theft amounted to $4.2 million, significantly more than the preliminary estimate of $2 million. Vincent had used this stolen money to fund his revenge plot, but he'd also spent lavishly on personal expenses. The forensic accountant had traced payments for luxury vehicles, expensive vacations, and a second apartment Vincent had been renting across town that I'd known nothing about. The apartment revelation suggested Vincent had been maintaining a separate life for quite some time, possibly planning his exit from the company long before he'd discovered my buyout proposal. But the investigation uncovered something even more disturbing. Police discovered that Vertice Entertainment Solutions had been used for similar schemes against other people. Patrick Hendricks had been running the production company as a front for blackmail operations, creating compromising footage of various targets at the request of paying clients. Vincent had found the company through connections in the tech industry, where apparently several other business partners had used similar tactics to gain leverage in disputes. The police found contracts and communications with at least 6 other clients who'd paid Patrick to manufacture blackmail material. Some of the targets were business rivals, others were spouses in contentious divorces, and one was a local politician whose opponent had wanted compromising footage before an election. The production company had been operating for almost 2 years, and their client list read like a directory of wealthy individuals with ethical flexibility. Several of the actors and crew members who'd been working at the warehouse that night claimed they'd believe they were participating in legitimate independent films. They provided statements saying Patrick had lied about the nature of the projects and had sometimes edited footage in ways that changed the context of what had been filmed. A few of them had become suspicious over time, but had continued working because the pay was better than they could get elsewhere, and they'd convinced themselves nothing truly illegal was happening. The woman with the clipboard turned out to be Patrick's business partner and romantic interest. She tried to claim ignorance of the blackmail schemes, but police found text messages between her and Patrick discussing various clients and their targets. She'd been actively involved in recruiting actors who were financially desperate and therefore less likely to ask questions about the productions. She'd specifically sought out people like Cassidy who had medical debt or family emergencies that made them vulnerable to exploitation. Cassidy spent hours giving her statement to police, detailing how she'd been recruited, what she'd been told about the film projects, and how she'd eventually learned the truth. She was visibly shaken when she discovered that other actors had been used in similar schemes and that some of the footage had actually been distributed to clients. The police assured her that because she'd cooperated immediately upon learning the truth, she wouldn't face criminal charges, though she might be called as a witness in future trials. The legal proceedings took months to unfold completely. Vincent was charged with multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and attempted extortion. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his attorneys eventually advised him to accept a plea deal rather than go to trial. He pleaded guilty to all charges and was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison with an order to pay restitution of $4.2 million plus additional penalties and interest. Patrick Hendricks and his business partner faced charges related to their blackmail operation. Patrick received an 8-year sentence after pleading guilty to conspiracy, extortion, and illegal surveillance. His partner received 6 years for her role in recruiting victims and facilitating the schemes. Several of their clients were also charged after police traced payments and communications, leading to prosecutions in multiple jurisdictions. The fallout from the case extended beyond criminal convictions. 2 other production companies that had been operating similar schemes were exposed during the investigation, leading to a broader crackdown on exploitation in independent film. Industry organizations implemented new protections for actors working on low-budget projects, requiring transparency about how footage would be used and prohibiting certain contractual terms that had enabled the blackmail operations. My relationship with Cassidy survived, though it required extensive repair work. We spent 6 months in intensive couples therapy, working through the breach of trust and the trauma of being manipulated by Vincent. Cassidy struggled with feelings of shame about having been deceived and used, even though she'd been a victim of Vincent's scheme. I dealt with my own guilt about not recognizing her financial desperation sooner and about putting her in a position where she'd felt unable to ask me for help. We postponed our wedding by a year to give ourselves time to rebuild our foundation. During that time, Cassidy became an advocate for exploitation prevention in independent film, speaking at industry events about her experience and working with organizations that provided resources for actors in vulnerable situations. She also pursued legitimate acting opportunities, landing several roles in theater productions and small but respectable film projects. I rebuilt the company with a new partner and implemented comprehensive financial oversight systems to prevent future embezzlement. The startup thrived after Vincent's departure, and we successfully secured additional funding that tripled our valuation. Vincent's wife divorced him during his trial, and his assets were seized to begin paying the court-ordered restitution. Cassidy and I married 2 years after that night in the warehouse. The ceremony was small and private, attended only by close friends and family who'd supported us through the aftermath of Vincent's betrayal. We both insisted on a prenuptial agreement that clearly defined financial boundaries and protections for both parties. The document wasn't romantic, but it represented our commitment to transparency and to never letting money become a weapon in our relationship. We maintained separate bank accounts and split household expenses equally despite my higher income. Cassidy continued her advocacy work and acting career, finding success in projects that aligned with her values. Vincent remained in prison, and I never responded to the 2 letters he sent attempting to justify his actions or to apologize. Some bridges were meant to stay burned. The warehouse where everything happened was eventually demolished to make way for new development. Sometimes I drove past the empty lot and remembered standing in that courtyard watching Vincent's plan collapse around him. The memory served as a reminder that betrayal often came from unexpected sources and that the people closest to you could harbor intentions you'd never imagine. But it also reminded me that careful preparation and a willingness to seek help could turn even the most elaborate scheme into its creator's downfall.